The church bells of Boston were still ringing when Helen Norris climbed out the vestry window in her wedding gown and ran. She ran past the hitching post where her father's carriage waited, past the startled eyes of a deacon carrying a tray of communion wine, past the alley cats that scattered before her like. She was something to be feared rather than a woman in white satin fleeing for her life. She did not stop to look back at the church doors, though she could hear them opening behind her, could hear her mother's voice calling her name in a tone that was less concern than horror at the scandal now unfolding. She ran until her slippers wore through at the toe and her lungs burned like she had swallowed hot coals. And she did not stop running, not really, not in her heart, until she was 3,000 miles from Boston and standing in the dust of a Wyoming cattle town with nothing left of that gown but the hem she had torn away to walk in. It was the spring of 1878, and Helen Norris had just turned 23 years old, and she had left behind a man named Cornelius Whitfield Pratt, standing at the altar of the First Congregational Church with a ring in his pocket, and a look on his face that Helen suspected was more offended than heartbroken. She did not feel guilty about that. She felt guilty about her father, who owed Pratt's family $4,000 and had arranged the marriage the way a man arranges the sale of a horse he can no longer feed. But she did not feel guilty about Cornelius himself, because Cornelius had never once looked at her like she was a person he wanted to know. He looked at her like a ledger he intended to balance. She had taken her mother's traveling case, sewn into its lining $12 that she had saved a nickel at a time from the household accounts over 18 months, and she had taken the train west because west was the only direction that did not lead back to Boston. She told the ticket agent in the depot that she was going to visit an aunt in Kansas, though she had no aunt in Kansas or anywhere else that would take her in, and she rode 3 days and 2 nights in a coach car that smelled of coal smoke and other people's suppers, watching the green hills of Massachusetts give way to the flat gold plains of a country she had only read about in dime novels her brother used to hide under his mattress. By the time the train reached the end of its line, a rail junction town in the Wyoming territory called Larkspur, she had cut the train of her gown off with a pair of sewing scissors somewhere around Nebraska, and she had sold her mother's cameo brooch to a peddler at a water stop for $6, and she had eaten nothing in 2 days but a heel of bread and a wedge of cheese she had smuggled from her own wedding breakfast. She stepped off the train into a wind that smelled of sagebrush and horse dung, and something willed her underneath it all, something that made her chest ache with a feeling she could not name, and she stood on the platform in her ruined wedding dress with her traveling case in one hand, and no earthly idea what she meant to do next. That was when the wagon nearly ran her down. She heard the shout before she saw the horses, a deep voice calling out, "Whoa now, whoa!" And then a hand closed hard around her upper arm and pulled her backward off the road so fast her feet left the ground for half a second. The wagon rattled past close enough that she felt the wind of it against her skirts, driven by a boy who did not so much as look back to see what he had nearly done. And when Helen found her feet again, she looked up into the face of the man who had saved her. He was not a handsome man in the way the men of Boston were handsome, all pomade and tailored collars. He was sun-browned and rough at the jaw, with a few days' growth of beard, and eyes the color of creek water in shadow, gray-green and steady. He wore a battered felt hat pushed back from his forehead, and a leather vest over a shirt that had been mended more than once at the shoulder, and he still had hold of her arm as though he had not yet decided it was safe to let go. "You are going to want to watch yourself standing in the road like that, ma'am," he said. "Larkspur men drive like the devil is chasing them on payday." "I am terribly sorry," Helen said, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to, thin with 3 days of fear and hunger. "I did not realize I was standing in the road." He looked at her then, really looked, and she watched his eyes go from her face down to the dress, the once fine white satin now gray with rail dust and cut short and ragged at the hem, the veil long gone, her hair coming loose from its pins in a way that would have mortified her mother. She braced herself for the question. She had rehearsed answers the whole way from Boston, stories about a sister out west, about a husband gone ahead to build them a home, about anything that was not the truth. But the man did not ask. "You look like you could use a meal," he said instead, releasing her arm now that the danger had passed, and he said it as plainly as if he were commenting on the weather. "There is a place 2 doors down that does not poison a body more than half the time. I am headed there myself." Helen looked down at her dress, at the $6 and change in her case, at the whole ruined shape of her life laid bare in the dust of a town she had never heard of a week ago, and she found herself laughing, a strange broken sound that was half a sob. "I imagine I look a fright," she said. "You look like a woman who has been through something," he said. "I have found it is generally none of my business what that something is unless a lady wants to tell me." "I do not," Helen said quickly. "Then I will not ask," he said, and he touched the brim of his hat. "Milton Bristol." "Helen," she said, and hesitated only a moment before adding, "Helen Norris." "Well, Miss Norris," Milton said, "let us get you that meal before you fall over in the street and give this whole town something to talk about for a year." The eating house was called the Sundown, a long, low building of unpainted lumber with a hand-lettered sign and a stove that threw more heat than the little room needed in the warming afternoon. Milton Bristol held the door for her, which was a small thing, but Helen noticed it, the way she noticed everything about him in those first hours, because she had spent so long being handled and arranged and spoken over that a man simply holding a door and waiting for her to walk through at first felt like a kindness she did not know how to receive. They sat across from each other at a plank table, and a heavy-set woman with flour on her apron brought them plates of beans and salt pork and cornbread without being asked, and Helen ate like she had not eaten in a week, because in truth she had barely eaten at all since the morning of her wedding. Milton did not comment on her manners or lack of them. He ate his own food and watched the street through the window and let her have the silence she needed, and when she finally set down her fork and looked up at him with her stomach fuller and her nerves a little less ragged, she found him watching her with an expression that was not pity and was not curiosity exactly, but something gentler than either. "You are not from around here," he said. "No," Helen admitted. "I am from Boston." "That is a long way to come to eat beans in Larkspur, Wyoming." "It was the end of the rail line," she said. "I did not have a plan beyond that." Milton nodded slowly, as though this were the most reasonable thing in the world. A woman arriving alone at the end of a rail line with a torn wedding dress and no plan. "Well," he said, "Larkspur is not much, but it will not chase you off either. There is a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Agatha Coyle, 2 streets over. She takes in respectable women for $1 a week, meals included, so long as you do not mind sharing a wall with her cat." "I have $4 and some change to my name," Helen said before she could stop herself, and then flushed, because it was not the sort of thing a lady admitted to a stranger, but something about Milton Bristol made her feel that pretending was no longer worth the effort. $4 will get you 2 weeks at Mrs. Coyle's," Milton said, "and there is always work in a town like this if you are not too proud for it. Miss Norris, I do not know what you left behind you, and like I said, that is your business and not mine. But I will tell you this much. Larkspur does not care much where a person comes from. It only cares whether they can pull their own weight once they get here." "I can pull my weight," Helen said, with more conviction than she felt. Milton's mouth curved, not quite a smile but close to it. "I believe you," he said. "You have got the look of a woman who is more stubborn than she is scared, and out here, stubborn will get you a good deal further." He walked her to Mrs. Coyle's boarding house himself, carrying her traveling case, though she protested she could manage it, and he waited on the porch while she knocked and made her arrangements with the widow, a small, sharp-eyed woman who looked Helen over from her ruined hem to her tangled hair, and did not ask a single question beyond whether she could pay the first week in advance. When Helen came back out to thank him, Milton was leaning against the porch post with his hat tipped back, looking out at the wide, dusty street and the mountains beyond it, blue and jagged against the lowering sun. "I own a spread about 6 miles out of town," he said, not quite looking at her. "The Bristol Place, folks call it, though there is not much to it yet but cattle and hard work. If you find yourself needing anything, or if that boarding house cat proves more than you can bear, you ask anybody in town where to find me. They will know." "Why?" Helen asked. "Why would you help me like this? You do not know me at all." Milton considered this for a moment, turning his hat brim between his fingers. "I had a sister once," he said. "She married a man our father chose for her back in Missouri, and it broke her clean in half. I was too young then to do anything about it but watch. I suppose I have got a soft spot for a woman who decided not to let that happen to her." He settled his hat back on his head. "That is not a question, Miss Norris. You do not have to answer it if I am wrong." Helen felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since the moment she climbed through that vestry window. "You are not wrong," she said quietly. "Then I reckon we understand each other well enough," Milton said, and he touched his hat brim again and walked off down the darkening street toward wherever he had left his horse, and Helen stood on the porch of Mrs. Coyle's boarding house and watched him go and felt, for the first time in 3 days, something that was not fear. The days that followed took on a shape Helen had not expected. She found work within the week, first helping Mrs. Coyle with the washing and the cooking in exchange for a reduction in her rent, and then, when the general store's owner, a stout kind man named Ezra Dunmore, learned she had a fine hand for figures and letters, she took on the keeping of his ledgers 2 afternoons a week for a wage that, while modest, was hers alone, earned by her own labor rather than handed down by a father settling a debt. She had never in her life earned a wage. The strangeness of it, the pride of it, kept her awake some nights turning the coins over in her mind like they were something holy. She saw Milton Bristol perhaps twice that first fortnight, once when he came into Dunmore's store for nails and rope, and found her behind the counter with ink on her fingers, and once when she was walking back from church, having discovered that Larkspur boasted a small Methodist chapel that met in the schoolhouse on Sundays, and he happened to be riding into town with a wagon of hides. Both times he tipped his hat and asked after her well-being in a manner so unassuming that she found herself almost disappointed by how little he pressed, though she could not have said, if pressed herself, what more she wanted from him. It was Mrs. Coyle who told her, over supper one evening, that Milton Bristol had buried his father 2 years past, and his mother the winter before that, and that he ran his cattle mostly alone, but for a hired man named Old Sully, and a boy of 15 called Tam who mucked the stalls for his board, and that there was not a soul in Larkspur who had a bad word to say about him, which Mrs. Coyle noted was rare enough in a town full of gossiping tongues that it ought to be considered a kind of miracle. "He is not married," Mrs. Coyle said, glancing sideways at Helen over her stew, in the manner of a woman who considers herself subtle and is not. "Was engaged once, they say, to a girl from Cheyenne, but she did not take to ranch life and went back east, nearly 4 years past now." "That is a sad story," Helen said carefully, keeping her eyes on her plate. "Sadder for him than for her, I expect," Mrs. Coyle said. "A man out here needs a wife who will not run at the first hard winter." She said this without any particular emphasis, but Helen felt the words settle into her chest anyway, because she knew, better than anyone, what it was to run. It was 3 weeks after her arrival in Larkspur that Helen saw Milton Bristol for what she would later think of as the 3rd time that mattered, though there had been other small crossings between them, a nod here, a word there. This time there was a dance at the schoolhouse, a spring social to raise money for a new roof, and Mrs. Coyle insisted that Helen come along, that it would do her good to be seen in company and not sit alone in her room mending stockings like a woman twice her age. Helen wore the only dress she had that was not made for a wedding, a simple blue calico she had purchased second-hand from a Larkspur seamstress with her first week's wages, and she felt, walking into that lantern-lit schoolhouse with its fiddle music and its long tables of pie, more like herself than she had felt in years. She danced twice with Ezra Dunmore's nephew, a shy young man who trod on her feet and apologized so many times she nearly laughed aloud, and once with the blacksmith, who talked of nothing but horseshoes the entire dance. And then Milton Bristol crossed the floor toward her with his hat left outside on a peg and his best shirt, still worn thin at the collar but clean and pressed, and asked if she would care to dance. "I am not much good at it," he admitted, as the fiddle struck up a slow waltz. "Ranch work does not leave a man much occasion to practice." "Neither am I," Helen confessed, though for entirely different reasons. They were not, either of them, very good, and they laughed about it more than once, Milton's hand steady at her waist and Helen's fingers light on his shoulder. And somewhere in the middle of that clumsy waltz Helen realized she had stopped counting the steps and started simply feeling the music. And she looked up at Milton and found him already looking at her. And something passed between them that neither of them named aloud, though it sat in the air like the smell of rain before a storm. "You have settled in well," Milton said, when the song ended and they stood a little apart, both a touch breathless. "Ezra tells me you have got a head for numbers sharper than most men who have kept his books before you." "I like the work," Helen said. "It is honest. Nobody's figures come out even unless the sums are true. There is something comforting in that." "I imagine there is," Milton said, "if a person has had reason to distrust things that are not what they seem." He said it gently, without any demand in it, and Helen understood that he was not asking, even now, even 3 weeks on, though the curiosity must surely have grown in him the way it had grown in every other soul in Larkspur who had heard the whispers of a woman arriving alone in a ruined wedding gown. "You still have not asked," she said. "I told you I would not." "Most men would have broken that promise by now." Milton shrugged, a slow, easy motion. "I am not most men, Miss Norris. And besides," he added with the faintest curve of a smile, "I have got a notion that when you are ready to tell me, you will tell me, and it will mean more coming from you free and clear than it would if I dragged it out of you with questions." Helen felt her throat tighten, and she looked away from him, out toward the open schoolhouse door where the night sky hung thick with more stars than she had ever seen above Boston. "His name was Cornelius Pratt," she heard herself say, though she had not planned to say it, had not planned to say anything at all that night. "My father owed his family a great deal of money. The marriage was to settle the debt. I do not think Cornelius Pratt ever once asked me what I wanted in all the months of our engagement. I do not think it occurred to him that I might want anything at all, beyond what he was generous enough to provide me." Milton was quiet a long moment. Around them the dance had resumed, fiddle music and stomping boots and the laughter of children weaving between the dancers' legs, but it felt to Helen as though she and Milton stood in a small, still pocket of quiet in the middle of all that noise. "I am sorry," Milton said finally. "That is a hard thing, to be treated like a debt paid rather than a person." "I ran," Helen said, "right out the vestry window in the middle of my own wedding. I do not know if I have ever done anything so foolish or so necessary in my whole life." "It does not sound foolish to me," Milton said. "It sounds like the bravest thing I have heard of in some time." "My mother will never forgive me," Helen said, and her voice cracked on the words, the first tears she had allowed herself since Nebraska rising hot and sudden. "My father is likely ruined. I have left a scandal behind me that will follow my family for years." Milton reached out, slow and careful, and took her hand, right there in the middle of the dance, in front of anyone who cared to look, and Helen did not pull away. "You cannot pay a debt with your whole life, Helen," he said, using her given name for the first time, and it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cool night air. "Whatever comes of it, whatever your family decides to think, you were right to run. A person is not a thing to be traded for $4,000. I do not care how respectable it looked on paper." "You do not know me," she whispered. "Not really. Not enough to say things like that." "I know enough," Milton said. I know you got off that train with nothing and built yourself a life in 3 weeks that most folks could not manage in 3 years. I know you keep Ezra's books straighter than his own nephew ever did. I know you dance badly and laugh about it instead of getting embarrassed, which tells me more about your character than 100 polite conversations ever could. He paused, and his thumb moved once, gently, across the back of her hand. I know I have thought about you more in these 3 weeks than I have thought about anything in longer than I care to admit. Helen's heart was pounding so hard she thought surely he must hear it. Milton, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name aloud, and she watched something shift in his face at the sound of it. You do not have to say anything, he said quickly. I am not asking for anything you are not ready to give. I know you have got a whole life back east still settling into the shape of whatever it is going to become. I am not fool enough to think a woman runs from an altar and lands in the arms of the next man who is kind to her. That is not what I want from you, Helen. I just wanted you to know where I stand so you are not wondering. I am glad you told me, Helen said softly. I have spent so long not knowing where anyone stood with me. It is a strange comfort having a man simply say a true thing out loud. They stood there a while longer, hand in hand at the edge of the dance, and when the fiddle finally wound down and the crowd began to break apart into knots of conversation and the serving of pie, Milton walked Helen back to Mrs. Coyle's in the cool spring dark, and at her door he did not try to kiss her, though Helen found herself, to her own surprise, half wishing he would. He only held her hand a moment longer than was strictly proper, and said good night, and left her standing on the porch with her heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar in her chest. Summer came on hard and fast that year, the kind of Wyoming summer that turned the grass gold by June and brought thunderstorms rolling down off the mountains most afternoons, and Helen's life in Larkspur took on a rhythm that felt, for the first time since she was a girl, entirely her own. She kept Ezra Dunmore's books. She helped Mrs. Coyle in the garden behind the boarding house, learning to grow beans and squash in soil that fought her every step of the way. She wrote letters to her younger brother, Thomas, the only member of her family she trusted not to burn her correspondence unread, and though she never told him exactly where she had landed, only that she was safe and working and, for the first time in years, happy, she felt lighter each time she sealed an envelope, as though she were slowly stitching herself back together one honest sentence at a time. And she saw Milton Bristol as often as the distance between town and his ranch would allow, which was to say more often than either of them likely admitted to anyone else. He came into town most Saturdays to trade, and he made a habit, transparent to everyone but himself, of arranging his business so that it brought him past Dunmore's store in the hours when Helen was known to be keeping the books. He took her walking along the creek that ran behind the schoolhouse on the long summer evenings, and he told her slowly, in pieces, about his own life, about his father who had come out from Missouri in the years just after the war with nothing but a wagon and a stubborn streak, about his mother who had died of a fever the winter before last with Milton holding her hand through the worst of it, about the fiancé from Cheyenne, a woman named Sarah Whitcomb, who had come to visit the ranch exactly once and left on the evening stage with her trunk still half unpacked, unable to bear the wind and the isolation and the endless work of it. I do not fault her for it, Milton said, one evening in late June as they sat on a fallen log by the creek, the sky above them going the deep purple-orange of a prairie sunset. It is a hard life out here, harder on a woman than most folks back east understand, I think. There is no theater, no fine shops, no calling on neighbors of an afternoon. There is cattle and weather and more work than there are hours to do it in. It does not sound so different from Boston in its way, Helen said. There is simply a different sort of cage there. Fine clothes and empty conversation instead of hard weather. I think I would rather have the weather. At least it is honest about what it wants from you. Milton looked at her sideways, the last of the sunset catching gold in his eyes. You say things sometimes, Helen Norris, that make me wonder if you were built for a place like Larkspur before you ever set foot here." "Maybe I was," Helen said, and found, saying it, that she believed it. It was in July that trouble arrived, riding into town on the same afternoon stage that had once carried Sarah Whitcomb away. Though this time it was not a woman fleeing the frontier, but a man come to claim one back east from it. Helen was behind the counter at Dunmore's, adding a column of figures for a shipment of flour, when the bell above the door rang, and she looked up to see a face she had hoped never to see again outside of her worst dreams. Cornelius Pratt had not changed. He wore the same fine gray suit, a touch dustier now from travel but still cut in the sharp Boston style that looked entirely wrong against the rough plank walls of a frontier store, and his mustache was waxed to the same precise points, and his eyes, when they found her, held the same flat proprietary look they had always held, as though she were a piece of misplaced furniture he had finally tracked down. "Helen," he said, and his voice too had not changed, that same clipped tone that always sounded as though he were speaking to a servant who had disappointed him. "I confess I did not expect to find you working behind a counter. How very far you have fallen." Helen's hands went still on the ledger. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, but she made herself set down the pen with steady fingers before she spoke. "Cornelius," she said, "I did not expect to see you again at all. Did you not?" He removed his hat, though the gesture held none of the courtesy Milton's habitual tip of the brim always carried, and set it on the counter as though he intended to stay a while. "You left rather a mess behind you, my dear. Your father is nearly ruined. Your mother has not left the house in a month for shame. And I have spent 3 weeks and a considerable sum of money tracking you across half the country, only to find you counting flour sacks in a town that does not appear on any map I have consulted." "I did not ask you to follow me," Helen said. Her voice shook, but she did not look away from him. "I did not ask for any of this. I left because I could not marry a man who saw me as a line item in his ledger, and I will not apologize for that, not to you and not to my father. Your father's debts do not simply disappear because you have found yourself a taste for adventure," Cornelius said, and his voice sharpened now, the polish cracking to show something colder underneath. "The arrangement was made. Contracts were drawn. You have humiliated 2 families and left your father facing ruin, and I have come to offer you one final chance to correct your mistake before matters become truly unpleasant for everyone involved, including yourself." "Unpleasant how?" Helen asked, though some cold part of her already knew. "I have friends in the territorial courts," Cornelius said. "It would not be difficult to have you returned east as a woman who abandoned her lawful commitments and fled with funds that were not entirely her own." He smiled thinly. "Your mother's brooch, I believe, sold to a peddler somewhere in Nebraska, was it not? That is theft, Helen, in the eyes of the law, whatever sentimental justification you may attach to it." Helen felt the blood drain from her face. She had not thought, in her flight, of how her small, desperate choices might be twisted into weapons against her, and the realization that Cornelius Pratt had not simply come to plead, but had come armed with threats made her stomach turn to ice. It was at that moment that the bell above the door rang again, and Milton Bristol walked in, having come to town early that Saturday to collect a mail order part for his hay mower, and he stopped just inside the doorway, taking in the scene before him with the quick, assessing look Helen had come to know as the way he read a room full of cattle or a room full of trouble alike. "Everything all right in here, Helen?" he asked, and though his voice was even, there was a coiled quality to it that had not been there a moment before. "This does not concern you, sir," Cornelius said, turning with the practiced dismissiveness of a man accustomed to being obeyed by strangers. "This is a private family matter." "Is that so?" Milton did not move from the doorway, but something in his stance shifted, widened, planted itself. "Helen, is this man troubling you?" "He is my former fiancé," Helen said, and she was proud later of how steady her voice came out, though her hands were shaking where they gripped the edge of the counter. "Cornelius Pratt of Boston." He has come to threaten me with a charge of theft over a brooch I sold for train fare, and to inform me that my father's finances are my responsibility to repair through a marriage I never wanted." Milton's jaw tightened. He crossed the store slowly, unhurried, and came to stand beside Helen at the counter, close enough that she felt the warmth of him at her shoulder, and he looked Cornelius Pratt up and down with an expression that Helen had never seen on his face before, something hard and flat, and entirely without the easy warmth she had come to know. "Mr. Pratt," Milton said, "I do not know much about Boston law, and I do not much care to learn. But I know Wyoming territory law well enough, and I know that a man does not get to threaten a free woman with a courtroom because she declined to marry him. If Helen Norris sold a piece of jewelry that belonged to her own family to fund her own travel, that is her business and no crime worth speaking of, and any judge west of the Mississippi will tell you the same." "You have no standing in this matter," Cornelius said, though his confidence had dimmed a shade at the sight of Milton's size and the flat certainty in his voice. "I have got every standing there is," Milton said. "This is my town, more or less, and Helen Norris is a woman I care for a great deal, and I am telling you plainly that you are going to get back on the next stage out of Larkspur, and you are not going to trouble her again. And if I do not choose to—" Milton's voice did not rise, but it dropped into something low and dangerous. "Then you are going to find that Larkspur has got a sheriff who does not take kindly to men who come into his town, making threats against decent working women. And you are going to find that I am not a patient man when it comes to folks who try to hurt people I love." The word love hung in the air of the store like a struck bell, and Helen's breath caught, and even Cornelius Pratt seemed to hear it land, his eyes flicking between Milton and Helen with something that might, in a lesser man, have resembled understanding, though in his case it curdled quickly into a sneer. "I see," Cornelius said. "You have found yourself a rustic protector, Helen. How very romantic. I suppose $4,000 means less to you now that you have got a cowboy to keep you fed." "You will not speak to her that way," Milton said, and he took one step forward, close enough that Cornelius Pratt, for all his fine tailoring and his Boston confidence, took a small involuntary step back. Ezra Dunmore, who had been standing quietly by the stove through all of this, cleared his throat loudly. "I believe," he said, in the mild but final tone of a man who owned the building they were all standing in, "that this conversation has run its course. Mr. Pratt, the afternoon stage leaves in 2 hours. I would recommend you be on it." Cornelius looked around the store once more, at Milton's unmoving bulk and Ezra's folded arms and Helen's white, set face, and something in him seemed to calculate the odds and find them unfavorable. He picked up his hat from the counter, brushed an invisible speck of dust from its brim, and turned back to Helen one last time. "Your father will hear of this," he said. "I hope the satisfaction of your rebellion is worth what it will cost him." "My father made his choice when he sold me to settle his debts," Helen said, and her voice did not shake now, not at all. "I am sorry for what he faces, truly I am, but I will not pay for his mistakes with the rest of my life, Cornelius. Not for you, and not for him." Cornelius Pratt left without another word, the bell above the door ringing sharp and clear behind him, and Helen watched through the window as he crossed the street toward the stage office, his fine gray suit already looking wrong and out of place among the dust and the horses, and she felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 3 months finally begin, slowly, to loosen. "Are you all right?" Milton asked, turning to her, and all the hardness had gone out of his face now, replaced with the gentle concern she had come to know so well. "I think so," Helen said, and found to her own surprise that she meant it. "I have spent 3 months afraid that man would find me, and now that he has and I have told him to his face that I will not go back, I feel lighter than I have felt in years." "You handled him better than I would have," Milton said. "I was about 2 words away from throwing him out the door myself." "I heard you," Helen said, and she looked up at him now, searching his face. "You said I was a woman you cared for a great deal. You said the word love, right out loud in front of Ezra and a man from Boston and anyone else who cared to hear it. Milton's ears went faintly red beneath his sun-browned skin. "I suppose I did," he admitted. "I did not exactly plan on saying it that way. It just came out seeing him stand there trying to frighten you." "Did you mean it?" Helen asked. Milton reached out and took her hand, right there in the middle of Ezra Dunmore's store, with the flour sacks and the coffee tins and the whole ordinary world looking on, and he did not look away from her when he answered. "I meant every word of it, Helen Norris. I have meant it for longer than I have had the courage to say. I love you. I do not care that you came from Boston with nothing but a torn dress and a handful of dollars. I do not care what your father owes or what that man back there thinks of a rustic cowboy standing in his way. I have loved you since the day I nearly ran you down in the road and you laughed instead of scolding me for it, and I am not sorry to say it out loud." Tears rose hot and sudden in Helen's eyes, though these were nothing like the tears she had cried in Nebraska or on the night of the schoolhouse dance. These were something else entirely, something that felt, at last, like relief and joy tangled together into one overwhelming feeling too large for her chest to hold. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have known it for weeks now, and I was too frightened to say it, because everything I ever thought I knew about love turned out to be a lie my father told to settle a debt. But you never once asked me what I was running from, Milton, not once in 3 months, and somehow that made it possible for me to finally stop running at all." Ezra Dunmore, watching this whole exchange from behind his stove with an expression of great satisfaction, cleared his throat once more. "I do not mean to interrupt," he said, "but if the two of you intend to declare yourselves in the middle of my store, I would appreciate it if you would at least let me close up for the noon hour first. Bad for business, all this romance. Folks come in for flour, not a theater show." Milton laughed, a real full laugh that Helen had not heard from him before, and it was such a warm and unguarded sound that she found herself laughing too, and Ezra Dunmore shook his head and went to flip his sign to closed, muttering something about young people and their timing, but he was smiling as he did it. That evening, Milton took Helen out to see his ranch for the first time. It sat 6 miles from town at the base of a long rolling ridge, a modest frame house with a wide porch and a stand of cottonwoods along the creek that ran through the property. And beyond it, spreading out in every direction under the enormous Wyoming sky, the grazing land where his cattle moved like slow, dark clouds against the gold grass. Old Sully, a weathered man of perhaps 60 with a limp from an old injury and a gruff but kind manner, greeted Helen with a nod and went back to mending a section of fence. And the boy Tam, 15 and gangly and full of questions, took one look at Helen and grinned so wide Milton had to tell him to mind his manners. "It is not much," Milton said, standing beside her on the porch as the sun went down behind the ridge, painting the whole sky in bands of rose and gold and deepening violet. "I have been building it up slow these past 2 years since my mother passed. It is not the kind of life you were raised to." "It is the kind of life I want," Helen said, and she meant it with her whole heart. "I do not want fine shops and empty conversation, Milton. I want honest work and true words and a man who tells me the truth even when it is hard to hear. I want this." She gestured out at the ridge, the cattle, the wide, indifferent sky. "I want all of this if you will have me." Milton turned to her, and in the fading light his face held an expression of such open tenderness that Helen felt her breath catch all over again. "Helen Norris," he said, "I do not have much to offer you. A house that needs a woman's hand in it, a herd that is smaller than I would like, and a life that will ask more of you than it gives back some seasons. But I love you more than I have ever loved anything in this world, and I would be the proudest man in Wyoming territory if you would agree to be my wife." "Yes," Helen said, before he had even finished the question properly, laughing through the sudden tears that spilled over. "Yes, Milton, of course, yes." He kissed her then, there on the porch of the house that would become their home, with the sunset burning gold behind them and old Sully pretending very hard not to watch from the fence line, and Tam whooping with unrestrained delight from the barn door. And Helen Norris, who 3 months before had climbed through a church window in a wedding gown to escape a life not her own choosing, found herself, at last, exactly where she was meant to be. They were married 3 weeks later, on a bright September morning, in the same small Methodist chapel that met in the Larkspur schoolhouse, with Mrs. Coyle weeping happily into a handkerchief, and Ezra Dunmore giving Helen away since her own father was 3,000 miles distant, and had sent, in place of a blessing, a short and bitter letter that Helen had read once, folded carefully, and placed at the bottom of her trunk, unwilling to let its coldness spoil the happiest day of her life. Her brother Thomas, against all expectation, had scraped together the fare and arrived 2 days before the wedding, having told their parents only that he was traveling to see about a job, and he walked Helen partway down the aisle himself before handing her off to Ezra with tears standing openly in his eyes. "You look happy, Helen," Thomas whispered to her before the ceremony began, straightening the simple ivory dress Mrs. Coyle had helped her sew from a length of good cloth, nothing so fine as the gown she had ruined fleeing Boston, but finer to Helen's eyes than anything she had ever worn, because this dress she had chosen for herself, and every stitch of it had been sewn with her own hands in the quiet evenings of the past weeks. "I have never been happier in my life," Helen told him, and it was the plain and simple truth. Milton stood at the front of the little schoolhouse in his best coat with his hair combed flat and his hands clasped tight together to keep them from shaking, and when Helen came down the short aisle toward him, past the folding chairs filled with the townspeople who had welcomed her so easily into their midst, he looked at her the way she had always imagined. As a girl, a man ought to look at the woman he was about to marry, as though she were the only thing in the whole wide territory worth seeing. The ceremony was short, the vows plain and heartfelt, and when the young circuit preacher pronounced them man and wife, Milton kissed her softly, right there in front of the whole town, and the little schoolhouse erupted into applause and cheering that Helen suspected could be heard clear out to the ranch. They did not have much of a wedding supper, only what Mrs. Coyle and the other women of the town had put together, but it was, Helen thought, the finest meal she had ever eaten, better than any grand affair her mother had planned for a wedding to Cornelius Pratt, because every dish had been made by hands that loved her, and every face around the tables was a face that had chosen to welcome her rather than one that had been obligated to attend. That first winter on the ranch was hard, as Milton had warned her it would be. The snow came early and heavy, and there were nights the wind screamed against the walls of the house so fierce that Helen lay awake listening to it, half afraid, until Milton would pull her closer under the quilts and murmur that the house had stood through worse winters than this and would stand through worse still, and somehow, held against his warmth, she believed him. She learned to bank a fire so it would hold through the coldest nights, learned to can the last of the garden vegetables so they would have something green to eat come February, learned to help old Sully with the calving when the weather turned, her hands growing steadier and more capable with each passing month, until Milton took to telling anyone who would listen that his wife could deliver a breech calf better than half the ranch hands in the territory. A boast that made Helen blush every time, but secretly pleased her more than any compliment about her fine Boston manners ever had. Spring came again, and with it a letter from Helen's mother, the first correspondence from her family since the bitter note her father had sent before the wedding. It was short and stiff and did not apologize for anything, but it asked in careful, hesitant sentences whether Helen was well, and whether she might consider writing more often, and Helen read it 3 times before she folded it carefully and wrote back a long letter describing the ranch, and Milton, and the calf she had helped birth in a snowstorm, and by the following autumn her mother had written twice more, each letter a little warmer than the last, until eventually, 2 years on, when Helen and Milton's first child was born, a strong, healthy boy they named William after Milton's father, Helen's mother sent a small parcel of baby clothes and a letter that finally, at long last, said the word she had waited 2 years to hear, that she was proud of her daughter and that she hoped, someday, distance and pride might allow for a visit. Helen's father never did right, not in all the years that followed, and Helen grieved that quietly some nights, but she had long since made her peace with the cost of the freedom she had chosen, and she found, looking at her son's face, at Milton's steady presence beside her, at the wide gold ranch land stretching out under the enormous Wyoming sky, that the peace outweighed the grief every single time. Cornelius Pratt, as it happened, married within the year, a wealthy widow from New York whose fortune settled his family's finances rather more thoroughly than Helen's dowry ever could have, and word reached Larkspur eventually, through a Boston newspaper that made its slow way west in a parcel from Helen's brother, that Cornelius had, in fact, found in his new marriage precisely the ledger-balanced arrangement he had always seemed to want, and Helen felt, reading the notice, nothing but a distant and passing relief that both their lives had settled into the shapes they were meant for, however different those shapes had turned out to be. The Bristol ranch grew, slowly but steadily, over the years that followed. Milton bought more land from a neighboring family who moved on to California and built out the herd until it was one of the largest in the county, and added 2 rooms onto the house, a proper kitchen for Helen and a second bedroom for the children who kept arriving with steady regularity, William first, and then, 2 years later, a daughter they named Grace, and then, 4 years after that, a second son, Charles, born in the same bedroom where his older siblings had come into the world. Delivered by the same competent hands of a doctor who had settled in Larkspur by then, and who told Milton, only half joking, that Helen Norris Bristol had the calmest disposition in a birthing room he had ever seen in 20 years of practice. Old Sully stayed on with the ranch until his knees gave out entirely, and then Milton built him a small cabin on the property and told him he was welcome to stay there the rest of his days, drawing no wage but full board, because a man who had given 30 years of honest labor to a family did not simply get put out to pasture like a spent horse. And old Sully wept, the one time in all the years Helen knew him that she ever saw him do so, and called Milton the finest man he had ever worked for, which, coming from old Sully, was as fine a compliment as existed in the whole territory. Tam grew into a capable young ranch hand, and eventually married a girl from a neighboring spread, and took over management of a portion of the Bristol land himself, working it in partnership with Milton in a manner that made both families prosperous. And every Christmas, the whole extended tangle of Bristols and their neighbors and their children gathered at the ranch house for a supper so large that Helen had to borrow tables from 3 different neighbors to seat everyone properly. On the 10th anniversary of the day Milton Bristol had nearly run Helen down in the dusty road outside the Larkspur depot, he took her back to that very spot, now grown up considerably with new storefronts and a proper brick depot building, the rail town having flourished in the decades since Helen's arrival, and he stood with her in the same patch of dust, though it was cobbled over now with proper paving stones, and he took her hand the way he had taken it that very first day, though this time to keep her steady rather than to pull her from danger. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Milton asked, the 2 of them a little gray now at the temples, 3 children between them and a ranch that had grown into something neither of them could have imagined a decade before. "I told you I looked a fright," Helen said, laughing. "You did," Milton agreed, laughing with her. "The finest fright I ever saw in my life. I knew that day, Helen, standing right here, that I was going to love you before I even knew your name properly. I have never been more grateful for a fool boy driving too fast through town than I have been every day since." "I ran from a wedding, Milton," Helen said, leaning her head against his shoulder as the depot bell rang somewhere behind them, announcing an incoming train full of strangers with stories of their own, stories she would never ask after unless they wanted to tell them, because that, too, was a lesson Milton Bristol had taught her, That kindness sometimes meant simply letting a person arrive without demanding to know the shape of what they had left behind. I ran from a wedding, and I ran right into the truest thing I have ever known. And I never did ask what you were running from, Milton said, smiling down at her, though I confess I am mighty glad all these years on that you decided to tell me anyway. I would have told you eventually, Helen said. You would have waited as long as it took. That is the kind of man you are. I would have waited a lifetime for you, Helen Norris Bristol, Milton said, and he kissed her there in the middle of the Larkspur Street, in front of the depot and the storefronts and the whole busy, ordinary life they had built together, and neither of them cared one bit who saw. That night back at the ranch, with the children long asleep and the lamps burned low, Helen sat on the porch beside her husband and watched the same wide Wyoming sky she had first seen a decade before, no longer strange to her now, but as familiar and beloved as her own two hands. She thought of the frightened woman who had climbed through a vestry window with nothing but a torn dress and a handful of dollars, and she thought of everything that woman had found in the years since: a husband who never demanded explanations, a family who had welcomed her without question, children who filled the house with laughter, a life built stitch by honest stitch out of her own two hands rather than handed down as payment for someone else's debt. And she found, looking out at the dark ridge line and the endless scatter of stars above it, that she would not trade a single hard winter, a single moment of fear on that long train ride west, for anything the life she had left behind might have offered her. Happy? Milton asked softly, his arm warm around her shoulders. More than I ever thought a person was allowed to be, Helen said, and she meant every word of it, there under the wide Wyoming sky, in the home she had run straight into without ever meaning to, beside the cowboy who had never once asked what she was running from, only where she wanted to go, and had spent every day since helping her get there. The years continued to unfold gently after that, as years tend to do for those who have found the place and the person they were always meant to find. William grew tall and steady like his father, with a quiet patience for the land that made Milton's chest swell with pride every time he watched the boy work a fence line or gentle a green colt. Grace grew clever and quick like her mother, with a sharp head for figures that had Ezra Dunmore, well into his older years by then, declaring more than once that he ought to have hired her the moment she was old enough to hold a pen, for she kept books even straighter than Helen had in her own younger days. Charles, the youngest, grew up surrounded by so much love and so much laughter that he never once doubted his place in the world, a fact that filled Helen with a fierce and grateful joy every time she considered how differently her own childhood had unfolded. Mrs. Coyle lived long enough to see all three children grown into their teens, and she never once let Helen forget that she had been the first person in Larkspur to open a door to her, though she always said it with a wink and a demand for a second slice of pie, whenever she came to visit the ranch, which was often, for she had become like a grandmother to the Bristol children in all the years since that first frightened night Helen had knocked on her boarding house door. Helen's mother did eventually make the long journey west, arriving by rail the same way her daughter once had, though under far gentler circumstances, and she stood on the porch of the ranch house and looked out at the ridge and the cattle and the grandchildren running wild across the yard, and she wept, and told Helen that she finally understood, seeing it all with her own eyes, why her daughter had chosen this life over the one that had been chosen for her. Helen's father never did make that journey, growing more bitter and more solitary as the years wore on, and Helen grieved that quietly for the rest of her days. But she did not let the grief poison the life she had built, for she had learned, in the 10 years since she fled that church in Boston, that a person could hold sorrow and joy together in the same heart without either one canceling out the other. Milton Bristol and Helen Norris grew old together on that same stretch of Wyoming land, watching the ranch prosper through good seasons and hard ones alike, watching their children marry and have children of their own, watching the wild open territory around them slowly fill in with fences and towns, and the steady march of a country finding its shape. And through every single year of it, Milton never once stopped looking at Helen the way he had looked at her that very first evening on the porch. As though she were the finest thing this whole vast country had ever offered him. And Helen never once stopped feeling, deep in her bones, the truth of what she had told him on their 10th anniversary in the dusty street where they first met. She had run from a wedding back east, frightened and desperate and certain only that she could not spend her life as payment for someone else's debt. And she had run, without ever meaning to, straight into the truest love of her life. A cowboy who had never once demanded to know what she was running from, only offered her, with quiet steady kindness, a place to finally stop. And that, Helen thought many years later, sitting on that same porch with her grandchildren's laughter drifting up from the yard and Milton's hand, weathered now but still so familiar, resting warm over her own, was the whole of the story worth telling. Not the wedding she had fled, nor the fear that had driven her 3,000 miles from everything she had ever known, but the simple, steady, unhurried way a good man had let her arrive, exactly as she was, and loved her more with every single year that followed.